Hello, very beautiful community. Let me know if you can see hear me. Sorry, I am late. I'm going to just grab some of the questions from the top. What I might do, I might take one from the top and one from the live chat as we go along. Beautiful community. All right. So let's take one from the top. Denki man, it's easy to become misanthropic nowadays. How can we learn to love human beings as they are? Let's try. Okay. Now, of course, there are some self-delighted, ironically misanthropic or sort of neo-misanthropic ways of relating to the world, which don't make people feel bad. Now, these are ways I don't share, but conceivably somebody could hold them and enjoy them and be relatively healthy psychologically. Let me try to give you an example. I suppose my second best friend in the world, who has an academic background, but also has worked outside academia and worked in politics and is done coaching as well. She would say, look at all of these silly, depoliticized, naive citizens of Western democracies, delusional and stuck in their fantasies about some kind of reversion to normal. They're a bunch of chimps floating on some kind of raft. They have no idea they're chimps. They have no idea it's a raft. So when the wave comes for them, let's laugh because it's predictable, not for them, but they're chimps. So they couldn't predict it. So that's a kind of misanthropy that doesn't say, oh my God, the world's a terrible place. It says, oh, the world's amazing. And look at all the chimps. And they're all humiliating and ludicrous and delusional. But it's a pretty amazing place. So that's a kind of misanthropy I really don't share. I'm not saying there's something wrong with it. That makes it not an option psychologically, but I just don't share it. Because I want to say I love the chimps on the raft. I'm not sentimental, so I'm not going to say the chimps aren't chimps. I'm going to say they're chimps, but I love them and I want the raft to work. So putting that aside, because you're talking about sort of dark and difficult forms of misanthropy, I presume, what I would say is, first of all, ask yourself the question, what do I get out of this, right? How does my misanthropy please me or serve my needs, right? What do you get from your misanthropy? Stay with that question. A second question is, try to think of that misanthropic voice in your head as a person inside you that you can then extract out and imagine meeting for coffee. Are you going to enjoy that person's company? And if not, why not? What are they going to be? Are they going to be fatalistic? Are they going to be cruel? They're going to be boring because nothing is good in their world? And then understand the profound importance for a well-adjusted life of an adequate relationship with ambiguity, right? The world is a terrible place. The world is a wonderful place. The world is a terrible place. The world is a magical place. And there are some things in the world that are at once magical and terrible. That's also possible. It's not just broken down into things that are terrible and things that are magical. And it's very important to understand that that's constitutive, right? It's not as though there is a way to get all the bad things away without taking the world away. And that ambiguity is real, but there might be something very coercive inside you that's stopping you from engaging with it freely and constructively, right? Is it proportionate to be darkly misanthropic about the world? In my view, no. And I'm not some kind of optimism merchant, as you might have guessed. So, hey Vlad, Gen Consensus, do ordinary Russians believe the non-stop lies of the regime? No. We've discussed this many times. In post-truth social environments, people neither believe nor are intended to believe all of the regime's lies. The regime is supposed to destabilize people's relationship with truth in general. Yo, hello. Hey, Vlad, what's your thinking on the Jason Arday Cambridge scandal? And what's the bigger story there? Love from Minnesota, or as Anya would say, Minnesota. And I think that we talked about it yesterday on the channel. And you can see what I said by going to Vlad Wexler at Substack, because I took down yesterday's video from the chat channel. There's nothing wrong with the video. And there's nothing wrong with a video going down badly, but something happened that meant I had to protect the community. And what happened is that the topic is clearly so hot, probably especially in the UK, that the algorithm started pushing it to people who have never encountered the channel before. And they were saying a lot of things and getting a lot of likes that basically celebrated tragedy. They were saying things like good riddance, a deserved end has come. And that was the very opposite of my message, which started with the first 3 points being all about compassion, without a sense of delusion about the details of the story, but compassion is where we start and where we stay, and then stay more, and then we move on to the other points. So go to Substack, vladvexel.com. And because there were all of these people who were new to the channel, who were saying good riddance and getting like 40 likes on their comments, I had a chat with Amalfitano, who supports my work on YouTube, even though I'm too sick to do that much of it, and she's got long COVID and she's too sick to do much either. So it's a bit of a comical cooperation, but we'll see where we go with it. But Amalfitano and I were just sharing some of the increasingly vile comments. And then I began to think, shall we look at taking the video down, because it's going to basically bring a lot of people who are celebrating death to the channel without the videos being shown to them, and then they're going to be amongst you. And that just shows actually there's a lot of ways for the channel to grow that are very destructive. And so the video did begin to pick up a few subscribers, and people do often subscribe to shit they hate. So I needed to cut that pattern off. And so I just stopped the video after a couple of hours, because the algorithm sent it to a place that was just going to be destructive for this community. So that's what happened there. It's one of those things, right? If you discuss a topic and then suddenly the algorithm begins to push your video to an audience you don't want, or to an audience that is in contravention of the values of the conversation you want to have, you've got to do something about it. And the only thing I could do was take it down, because these channels are mine, but I don't control the algorithm at all, as you can guess. All right, let's take one question from above. Stepan from Ukraine presumably is asking, what do you make of Zelensky naming a Ukrainian military brigade after the Ukrainian insurgent army, the UPA, and the subsequent diplomatic crisis with Polish reaction to that? Did Zelensky do it deliberately, knowing it would intensify tensions between Ukraine and Poland? So it's very important that I know much more about Ukraine than probably anybody in this room who isn't Ukrainian. But there is no equivalence between the quality of my insight on Russia and the quality of my insight on Ukraine, even though I regularly speak to experts and Ukraine experts and people who are in Ukraine and get insights and updates. So here's going to be the big picture answer that I can bring you value with. Ukraine has three nationalisms. The first nationalism is a civic nationalism, and that's an entirely delightful and benign nationalism. The second nationalism is an ethnic nationalism. And a third nationalism, which has some place but also has risks. And a third nationalism is hyper-identity politics nationalism. And that is, funnily enough, a Western import of something that is already dying in the West, but has got into Ukraine. But the thing that everybody here needs to understand is that the waves of it that you've seen, it's less now, but the waves of it you've seen in the opening years of the war on social media platforms do not represent how Ukrainians feel. They represent how certain voices, growing audiences on Twitter or wherever else feel, right? So that's a sort of politics that says, oh my God, there's this thing and it's from the Soviet period, so we must take it away. Oh my God, some Russian writer got invited to speak somewhere, so let's ask for them not to be invited anymore. Or oh my God, too many Ukrainians are speaking Russian. That will pass, but it's also a feature of the kinds of nationalisms that have developed. Ukrainian leader has to reckon with all of these, and he has to reckon with the ethnic nationalism at a time of war. So in very big, broad brushstrokes, a decision like that is Zelensky balancing the political expediencies, right, of indulgence of these different nationalisms. Is it, what's your question? I probably should leave it to Ukrainian experts to answer this, but roughly speaking, it would be a domestic, you're asking if it was done to provoke Poland. I wouldn't think so. It's a domestic decision with foreseen foreign consequences, but underestimated foreign consequences, I would say. Of course, this stuff also doesn't go down well in the West, because in the West, we're certainly going to be skeptical of mid-20th century Ukrainian nationalism in its engagement with the Nazis and its engagement with massacre-type activities. But quite frankly, the West's support now for Ukraine is so expediency driven that this sort of stuff basically does Ukraine not really any significant damage in the West. So from that kind of prudential political point of view, it's an issue in Poland. It's not going to be an issue with the West European countries, realistically. But that's the balancing act the Ukrainian president has to engage in. Okay, let's take a question from the latest live chat. Proda is asking, does it matter if I mix cotton clothes with things like towels and the back doormat in the tumble dryer with the dryer set on cotton mode, or should I be using mixed mode? Thank you. Well, I think this is the best question of the day. I would say that if you were to copy me, you'd be fairly reckless about what you put in the washing machine. I did update my washing machine a couple of years ago because there was a terribly cheap old washing machine here that was just ruining all my clothes. So I've got a good quality washing machine now, but I throw random stuff into it when I do my own laundry, which is not most of the time. All right, let's go back to the questions left before. Noah, reactionary right-wing populism has been more ascendant lately. How wary should we be of left-wing governments leading to authoritarian democratic collapse over the next 20 to 30 years instead? In the West, not wary at all. I mean, comparatively to the bigger threat, at least. Outside of the West, it's possible. In the West, the dominant wave coming our way is alt-right authoritarian populism. What I would, though, say is that in discourse, that alt-right authoritarian populism will get increasingly left on the economy. Will be naive to expect that'll translate too much into practical policy, but in discourse, they're going to be quite left into the 2030s on economic disempowerment and inequality. They're also going to tie that to race. So they're going to tie class and social justice with white identitarianism. So it's going to be harder to pick apart exactly where these parties are, except that they're anti-democratic. So in the West, that's overwhelmingly the bigger threat. You could have, during the height of the Cold War, I suppose, argued the other way. So this is not some kind of rule. This is a matter of which kind of historical moment we are in. Let's take a live question. Do we have any super chats I might have missed? Hey Vlad, DJ is asking, does Putin recognize that Russia is the junior partner in its relationship with China? And if yes, does it irritate him? It does, and he does, but he is so set on focusing on the West as both a positive and a negative object of focus that this becomes almost preposterously secondary for Putin. And this is a reasonable source of critique of him by his political opponents and certainly by the liberal Russian opposition in the West. So yes and yes, but there is a disbalance there because Putin's radically anti-Western position is very structured by the West itself, right? So there's a kind of a normative dependence on the West that's part of Russia's rejection of the West. The other thing I'd say about China is don't underestimate the long history of that relationship of dependence going the other way. And so the historical credibility that the Soviet Union has got in China over decades still plays a role in that relationship. So don't eliminate that either. But I'll leave it to Chinese experts to say more about that. Ozzy, putting me on the spot there, Ozzy. Vlad, you've mentioned that you choose not to work with serving politicians. Why is that, mate? So I do consulting. I certainly consult people who work for big NGOs, also transnational financial institutions. Often it'd be questions like, how do I deal with my values clashing with my job, or how do I deal with the latest obliteration of USAID by the Trump administration? How do I make my civic and political contribution across my lifetime? I'm certainly happy to consult on various kinds of political projects. I don't consult with active politicians for a reason really I haven't much elaborated, but the sort of short of it would be that I try not to do anything that is going to affect your experience of my arbitration of political stories and political reality. And so if I did that, I would certainly have to declare that, right? If I suddenly was consulting people in the Labour Party, it would create a challenge for me, funnily enough, unless it was at some very abstract level of, what's they wanted to know how modern society should deal with certain challenges. Um, uh, so that's why I basically don't consult sort of active politicians to whom I might be sympathetic, let alone ones to whom I'm antipathic. All right. Echelon, do you consider putting your videos on another platform? Something that Amalfitano and I are talking about. I am a believer in it in principle, yes. So I'm a believer that if you are on one of 20 platforms, you should be able to access my videos there, even if it's just 8 people watching on that platform. So I'm doing a little bit of that, but it's not systematic. And I want to get it systematic so that you can consume, sorry for the word, you can watch and listen and engage on wherever platform you find the least offensive to your sensibility. What the hell? Let's take another question. Hey, Vlad, maybe a bit of a different question from JK, but can you speak on the role of art and artists? I mean, with the context of the topics discussed on your channel. So I would tend to be predominantly skeptical of a coming together between art and politics, even though art is so terribly dependent on politics, right? One of the things that this alt-right authoritarian wave is doing and going to do is defund arts that are of importance, of great public importance. So they are a threat. This politics is a threat to the arts, but it doesn't mean that the arts should get political because of that. Mostly they are important because they are not, in the first instance, political. Now, beyond that, of course, there is some art that is essential to political imagination. And you might argue all art is a little bit relevant to that anyway, but there is some art that is very directly relevant to that. So sure, we could talk about that. So for instance, the work of the visual artist Anselm Kiefer is one of the best possibilities in the visual arts for Germans and Europeans to get transparency about their recent past, about where they've come from and where they're going. So it has real political significance. It's liberating. Then, of course, there are people like the opera director Peter Sellers, with his wonderful electrocuted hair. And Peter would say, let's bring together a Mozart opera and deep immediate concerns about social justice. And that's also wonderful, that this is something you can do badly, something you can do well. But what you don't want to do is get too far down the line with some kind of instrumental story about art that it's got to serve some kind of benign political purpose. That's not how it works. Invisible Poor. Hey, Vlad, I'm discovering continental philosophy from a maths background, have read some modern philosophy. Why does continental philosophy feel so empty of arguments? It depends on what you read. I mean, Foucault is going to be more masculine and robust than Derrida. Nietzsche is a continental philosopher, and he's the greatest moral philosopher of the past 200 years. You're not going to say he's not rigorous. He's got a distinctive style. That means you're going to have real problems capturing what he says in a set of sort of condensed and analytical propositions. But that's the point. He wants you to be stuck like that. That's why he writes like that. So, as my hero Bernard Williams once said, the distinction between continental and European philosophy is a sort of analytical philosophy. The distinction between continental and analytical philosophy, which is the common distinction made, is a cross-categorization. It's like separating cars into four-wheel drive and Japanese. So that's enough on that. Zonk, yo, Vlad, complaint. Tyrant in the Kremlin gets called Mr. Putin. His Excellency Count Binface, leader of the Recyclons, is dismissed as the bin. Come on. You've caught me out with a really bad hypocritical inconsistency. And I put up my hands in shame and hang my freshly shaven, self-administratedly shaven head. Yo, invisible poor. I think asking another question. Did the 2008 financial crisis change your view about liberalism? Curious to know how if it did. No. The last time I changed my view about liberalism was in 2003. And that was around the time I was getting sick. And the only thing that I changed in my views was about the relation of value pluralism as a thesis about the nature of values, a universal thesis about the content of values, and the way they get elaborated and the culture and so on. And modern arguments for something like, liberal democracy. And I felt that in the writings of Isaiah Berlin, there needed to be a constitutive relationship between value pluralism and liberalism. And then I realized that I was wrong. Funnily enough, I was about to give a paper at the Occam Society in Oxford, I think in late 2003, called Why Isaiah Berlin Failed to Ground His Liberalism. And I got sick, and by that time I had quit. So no, I'm certainly not going to change any view about liberalism that I have until I die, because I have relatively few views, and if my views were ones one could change, that'd be too superficial. That's actually one of the interesting things in philosophy. It's usually a sign of open-mindedness that you don't change your views, because it means you're incredibly open-minded and slow in the way you arrive at a position. That's not true for a lot of people. A lot of people just sloppily go somewhere when they're 32, and then it kind of looks embarrassing when they're 60, because the way careerism works, you pretty much are under significant pressure to keep defending that puddle you landed yourself in at 32 and keep writing footnotes to it. So it takes a lot of career sacrifice sometimes actually to say, no, what I did before was crappy. So the 2008 crisis is a central part of the loss of trust, of the acceleration of democratic decline. But certainly, if you have sound views about liberalism, whatever that means, you're not going to need to change them because of such historical events. All right. Patry, what is the strategy of the agro-Führer, the potato dictator, Mr. Lukashenko? Russia is stealing their resources. Ukraine is threatening them with attacks. Life must be tough. Well, he has got cards in his relationship with Moscow. Maybe I'll leave the bigger political question aside, and maybe Belarus experts can do this better than me. But certainly psychologically, Lukashenko, who has a personality disorder, he does have narcissistic personality disorder like Trump does, and Putin doesn't. So Lukashenko is obsessed with power and narcissistic supply of various kinds, and he'd literally do anything. So he'd take any role in politics. If Belarus got somehow entirely absorbed into Russia, Lukashenko would be delighted to participate in Russian politics. He does not give a hoot. This is a guy with a personality disorder, drunk on power. Maybe it's worth doing a chat about that Belarusian-Russian dynamic. I'll think about it, and then in that case, I'll be able to answer your question more. With Putin, DJ is asking, regularly working to convey an image of himself being an Orthodox Christian, how can an outsider determine that he is practically an atheist? You would need to speak Russian probably to determine that and observe Putin, and then you'll see. Kathip, hey Vlad, what do you think is the most likely resolution to the Ukraine war, and how far away do you think it might be? Well, it depends on how you see it. If you see it in the broadest sense of the pattern we're witnessing, which is the implosion of the Russian Empire, then this is a decades-long process, and roughly we are perhaps at the end of the beginning of it. We're not yet even in the middle of it, so we're early still. If you see it in terms of, well, when is this fighting going to stop, which is a narrower question, then it's going to stop when it becomes unsustainable for one of the two sides. You've often got this sort of carousel in the media where people say, oh, Russia's doing better, Ukraine's doing better, Russia's doing better. And usually these are meaningless bits of analyses in relation to what's going to happen down the line, because this is a race in which at some point one side will look more sustainable in its endeavor. At another time, another side will look more sustainable. What Ukraine has proven beyond doubt recently is that Putin simply cannot rely like he thought he could before on time. In other words, Putin's position a couple of years ago was time is just on my side. Now, objectively, he can't say that. Now, time could be on his side, but it might not be. So that's the new reality that Ukraine has created. And it takes away a certain kind of tactic of Putin's toward the conflict. Okay, let's take an old question. Yo, Vlad, Thatcher is asking, you said you were 3 to 4 out of 10 in a tongue-in-cheek way as a philosopher. You would be 3 to 4 out of 10 if you were healthy. How does one accurately self-categorize the ceiling in areas of passion without loss of motivation? I've struggled with this often. This is difficult. One thing that's worth saying about people of the greatest capacity for achievement, people who would call geniuses, low-level geniuses, mid-level geniuses, high-level geniuses. I do like to break geniuses down into several rungs. They are very often driven by a consciousness of their powers. If we look at the greatest world historical geniuses, something like Beethoven, let's say, what's Beethoven driven by? He is driven by the superficial sort of Beethoven documentary might say love of music. No. Beethoven is driven by consciousness of his capacity to radically transform the musical language he inherited from Mozart and Haydn, roughly. So consciousness of one's powers drives one on. At lower levels of excellence, that can still be so, but it's less of a driver there, right? What spurs you on? Well, I'm in the top 30% of professional philosophers. Well, great, whatever. Then it's going to be about something else driving you. What I would recommend is that you're driven by love and openness to being surprised by the objects of love with which you interact. Now, that's compatible with the first thing I put on the table, but that is something that is closer to something that everybody can have. There is elitism here too, because the more gifted you are, the deeper your love would be, right? your love for Beethoven as a professional musician, right, will be deeper if you're a more talented musician, because you're going to be closer to Beethoven. You're going to be able to engage with what he put and maybe even convey it in sound better. The less good a musician you are, the less deep your love is going to be. And this is an important kind of elitism you can't get out of, right? But it's important here as much as possible to try to get out of yourself, right? I'm not against ranking yourself, and I have absurdly ranked myself, but you can get out. You have to also be able to get out of yourself and just be absolutely overwhelmed by how extraordinary certain things are. What you, on the other side, don't want to do is think that you've got skills you don't have. And the best way to, deal with that is to just keep exploring what it is that you might be able to do. You might always be able to do more than you think, might be less in some aspects. It could be that what you're able to do is different to what you expected, neither better nor worse. So all of that is important. James Smith is saying spectrum of geniuses. Yeah. So, for example, Beethoven and Shakespeare would be class 1 geniuses, world historical geniuses. These are very, 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 very rare. Somebody like Wittgenstein would be a class 2 genius. So less than a world historical genius, but still transformationally remarkable. And then my heroes, Richard Wolheim and Bernard Williams, would be low-level geniuses. And somebody like Charles Taylor would be a low-level genius. He's the best living philosopher today. He'd be to the lower end of the low-level genius rung, maybe, and Williams and Wolheim would be higher up. One of the tragedies in philosophy is that you probably need to be not far below that low-level genius rank to even do it well, which means that most professional philosophers can't do philosophy well. So there you go, and these rungs, these are my genius rungs. Two questions. Dana the Hill. Did you get your kitchen fixed? No, but my beautiful friend Kevin, who has a photography studio not far from here, came and took away the cabinets to try to fix them for me, and then bring them back and see if you can attach them to the wall. But a lot broke. It was a kind of probably a couple of £1,000 job. The stove smashed. It was quite apocalyptic. Now that Trump, Dane is also asking, is lurking in Greenland again, how do you judge the initial Danish response to Trump's threat so far, and can we draw any lessons from it? I was going to do a separate video about this, so I'll only say one thing. It's important for European countries to be very preemptively tough on the Trump administration over this, and to take the rhetoric of the Trump administration seriously and beat it back. But I'll do a video soon that addresses your question, because we have the Texas Oil Company story with Dr. Phil in tow, and of course we have Trump posting about Greenland again. Alex, good to see you, Alex. What are the consequences of using some art or skill as self-rescue? Does it have built-in limitations? Does it have skew and bias, or is it merely a motive among motives for engaging in that skill or art? So, if you are stuck with something as self-rescue, if you are stuck with poetry or cooking, winemaking as self-rescue, then you could have an absolutely wonderful relationship with that activity, but there's going to have to be some ceiling because it is too functional for you to have the certain kind of freedom you need to really excel at it. However, it's very important not to miss this mechanism, Alex, and that is that very often there is a way to go forward through self-rescue rather than back out of it. So take somebody like the celebrity chef Nigel Slater, who lives not far from here. For Nigel Slater, having the house infused with a baked cake on a Sunday morning is a certain form of self-rescue. It normalizes the world for him. But he has pushed his self-rescue relationship so far that he's gone through self-rescue, has gone forward through self-rescue, and come out on the other side. And ended up in a space of more genuine creativity. And here, very importantly, Freud tells us that when significant creative human endeavor is at hand, neurosis comes out of the picture. That's very important. And so you can go through a neurotic relationship with something and come through by, even through your neurotic relationship with the deepening and deepening and deepening and deepening the way you engage until it transcends itself. And so for Nigel now, he starts from a place of self-rescue, but in the end, what happens is that he comes out of it and his imagination and playfulness takes flight, and he breaks down the rigidity of the self-rescue that is the initial impulse for him to have the cake there on a Sunday morning. Atlas, yo, do you think in the short term Andy Burnham can fight Farage and Polanski to a narrow electoral win, or is a reform government of some kind inevitable? And what are the implications of this either way for the 2030s? So a reform government, I would judge, is still likely. Andy is a much better communicator than Keir. Even though I like Keir very much, he's wonderful. I've not met him. People in my life have spent time with him. Everybody's very positive about Keir, and I'm drawn to him. I like him. I also perceive neurodiversity there, and I like how that sits in him too. So I like him. But I didn't love him in politics. For me, he was too much a 1998 politician. Andy Burnham has a better ability to feel where the wind's blowing politically and realize that he is definitively not in 1998. However, he is likely to fail, not just because succeeding now requires enormous political stature and talent, because the circumstances are so difficult, but also because there's going to be a limit on what the party allows him to do. So Burnham can succeed, but it's very difficult for him to succeed. It would be an exceptional achievement if he really succeeded. Polanski is not to be compared to Farage. Polanski connects to a narrow demographic in the UK. Farage, more than any other politician, speaks to the whole country. Andy Burnham is trying to rival that. We're going to see how that goes. So I would say that as things stand, a reform government is a 50-50 coin toss, or more likely than not. If it happens, the government will implode catastrophically because there are a bunch of amateurs who have no idea how to do governance. Having said this, they have a very good chance of taking power. In fact, if they make no mistake, they will take power, reform. So they will then implode, and there will be a democratic opportunity again for constructive political forces, which they're either going to take or they'll miss, and then we're going to have more disciplined and more skilled authoritarians when it comes to keeping power. Farage is one of those who's good at acquiring power potentially, but he's no good at keeping power. He might have a go at breaking the institutional game in the UK, but he's going to be profoundly incompetent as a prime minister, bewilderingly incompetent. But he's on track as things stand. Okay, let's take another one. Harmonia, hey yo Vlad. Care to comment on my theory that you have a post-truthergeist in your kitchen? I think that's probably true. As a post-truth crisis that broke the kitchen cabinets. Let's take one more. Corinthians. When I say the online left's gleeful reaction to Mangione, I recognize fascization, how fascized is the left in the US on a scale. 4 out of 10, 7 out of 10. Nobody in the US is fascized 7 out of 10, not even Trump. Trump's probably pushing a 5 or a 6, in my view. See my video about Trumpism and Putinism. The two main political forces in the United States at the moment are alt-right authoritarianism, Trump, and technocratic centrism. There's not that much left. You could paint a little bit of a picture of social democratic populism with a politician like Zoran, but there's very little left in the United States. What has over the last few years been taken as left has been a certain kind of hyperliberalism, but it's not left, right? There's very little emphasis on class there, for example. So this is what I've called hyperidentity politics. So I don't know what you're talking about exactly. I think you're talking about how hyperliberals react to political issues, not the left. So how fascized are hyperliberal reactions in their polarization? Yeah, I mean, when they play a politics of enemies, that's a soft fascization there. Yes, there's a degree of fascization there. I do think that outside of a couple of social media platforms, that movement is declining. So I struggle to guess. I don't see any left fascization in America at all on any scale. I see some hyperliberal fascization, but it's in decline, and the apocalyptically growing fascization is the alt-right. SG. Yo, Vlad, what advice do you give to someone who believes they're an expert in their profession, but keeps needing to confirm this with a self-doubting internal critic? Let's take you back to what we said a few tens of minutes ago. Take that internal critic out of yourself, put it on an empty chair in a cafe, and go out for a coffee with that critic and talk to that critic as though they were a person, and ask them why they're so cruel to you, why they're so persecutory of you, why they're so mean to you. And do you really want that? And also ask, given that that critic lives inside you, what need of yours they're serving. What do you get out of that? What kind of desires of yours does it meet? Because, of course, we can have that very harsh critic inside us because We can't face certain things in the world, but it's also possible that we can have it inside us because it meets some of our needs. So what needs of yours is that critic meeting? That if the needs melted down a bit, you'd be free a bit from that critic. Now, of course, that's separate to the question of your sort of more impartial evaluation of where you're at. But the point is that it's surely good to doubt yourself, but it's got to come with a degree of positive regard for oneself, a degree of play, a degree of curiosity. And of course, the sort of rigid self-evisceration is unconstructive. So try to find who that person is inside you, and chat to them, get them out of you, engage with them. But also don't be tough on the part of you that wants to beat that person down, because you're just going to be aligning with that person inside you if you're beating them down, because they're in the beat down business themselves. Mick, unrestricted immigration is pushing voters right. How do we prioritize our democracy before we ourselves become asylum seekers fleeing fascism? Mick, I think that's a fair and important question. At the moment, there is a conflict between anything like a just and fair and human rights based and cruelty free immigration policy and sustenance of democracy. And I think we've got to be honest and face that conflict. And a lot of people in the center, wherever there is a left on the left, are not sufficiently awake to that. What has basically happened in many democracies like mine, the UK, is that we have taken more people than we can remotely get civic consent for from the majority of the population. And that's created a crisis. And it's absolutely no good to call people racist or closed-minded. Legitimacy in the modern world politically springs from a sense of community within a state. And the question is, how much do you need? How much of a monoculture do you need to sustain a democracy? And the answer is, well, the truthful answer is you can't have a monoculture these days. It's not just a bad idea, it's a completely unrealizable idea, which is why so many of these folks on the alt-right are in fantasy land. But nevertheless, you have to have a certain degree of homogeneity. That's why I emphasize values like solidarity and the public good all the time. So we're screwed. We've basically taken a number of people that is not compatible with the sustenance of democracy. And what the alt-right are doing is noticing that and then doing everything to fuel it, so that people feel even more resentful. And it's working for them. So what you've got to do is convince a majority of people on the doorstep that you've got control of your border. And one of the cruelest elements of this political need is dealing with what is called, some people, of course, critique this term, illegal immigration. You basically cannot have any people illegally in your country in any great number for any length of time under the current political circumstances without hugely giving ground to the alt-right. I genuinely believe in being bold and standing up for things you believe in. So I'm not somebody who thinks you need to yield. I am somebody who thinks you actually probably on most issues need to radicalize to beat the alt-right, not yield to them. However, here is a clear case where legitimacy has been lost, and we've lost people. So to get them back, you need to convince them that their country is not just some kind of tiny boat bobbling up on the waves of globalization with completely permeable borders. Because, we're living in an age in which people are desperate to feel at home politically, and yet it's impossible to feel at home politically in the modern world. There is no home for anybody politically in the modern world. It's a naive idea, but a needed idea. And in that environment, technocratic centrist politics allowed their countries to absorb numbers of people coming in that are simply not compatible, right, with anything remotely resembling the civic consent you need to generate for that. So this is really brutal because it's also naive to say that you can take steps to toughen immigration policy without being cruel. So this is one of those Isaiah Berlin conflicts where you're sort of doomed to lose whichever way you go. But what I say is that you need to do whatever work it takes to persuade a majority of people that you've got control of the border and that your country is a country, that it feels to them like a country. Otherwise, you're going to be losing not just to Farage, but to Rupert Lowe and the much more overtly white supremacist politics of Restore UK. So that's where we are. Unless we tackle immigration properly, we're basically on course to lose our democracies. And can you tackle it in a human rights friendly, cruel free way? No, you can't. Right? You're going to be turning people away in a way that's painful. JB, is there a valid fear of radical Islamism in the UK? Yes, but there is also a huge amount of Islamophobia in the UK. We are on fire with Islamophobia, I'm afraid. And it's based on culture war discourse, demonizing certain groups. It's also based on a failure to understand what it means to live under culture in a different way to you. We tend to make a very sharp distinction in the West between the secular and the religious sphere. In the Muslim world, that is not conceptually available or necessary in the same way. We really struggle to grasp that, because then from our point of view, it turns out that it looks like, even though it isn't, but it looks like everything that anyone does in that culture is about their religion. And therefore, from our prejudicial point of view, all the bad things that happen in that country are caused by their religion, because they say that you can't separate the religious from the non-religious sphere. And that's an elementary basis for Islamophobic prejudice. And it's sort of self-reinforcing also, because when you do bad things in the Islamic world, you tend to say, oh, God says that's okay. Or this imam says that it's okay. So and so this mutual reinforcement where people do bad things, say, oh, Islam made me do it. And we in the West say, oh yeah, look at that, Islam made them do it. So I'm very worried about the extent of Islamophobia at the moment in the UK. But also, is it fair to be concerned about certain bits of radicalization that might be incompatible with democratic society, and other difficult patterns we need to be wary of? Sure. It's both, but you've got to take the Islamophobia seriously. And anti-Semitism, unfortunately, is growing in the UK, and Israel's actions have been a historical spur for that, unfortunately. Sergey, as a self-proclaimed liberal Russian, your channel has been a massive help for me in seeing the logic and sense in the senselessness of the regime in my country. No questions, just a little donation. Sergey, thank you very much. And I mean, this is different for you because I am only a tiny bit Russian. I feel overwhelmingly Western and European. I only feel a tiny bit Russian. And you feel completely Russian, or much more Russian than me. I don't know. Maybe completely Russian. It's got to be very painful for you. What on earth is happening with that country? It's absolutely devastating, the sort of catastrophic and to a large degree self-inflicted cul-de-sac it got itself into. It's very, very disastrous to watch. I mean, we're speaking about our own problems here, but these are problems on a totally different scale. Mick says, I'd rather Andy Burnham meet this immigration challenge now than Farage meeting it in a far more extreme way later. Yeah. Mass turn. Yo, Vlad, I've been quite focused in my life working on advancing my skills in drawing and other crafts, but I found it's not the exact same as being an artist. What are some ways to be better with that? Well, I don't think you need my lecture on what is or what isn't art. You just need to focus on what activity you're doing and how much you enjoy it and what role it has in your life. I mean, I think that there are wonderful ways of doing something that's art, and there are wonderful ways of doing something that's craft. And there is no need to progress a craft to an art as though that's going to make the craft better. It's not going to make it better, it's going to be different. So there's a lot of extraordinary craft work also. That is an important part of our culture that we don't need to call art, and it's not a criticism of it that it might not be. So don't get bogged down unless you're curious about them and all these distinctions I make about what is and what isn't art. Play more with your activity. Explore what about it makes you enjoy it. Give yourself as much time as possible for it. Be brave, take some risks with it. And then find out what role it has in your life. Enjoyment here has to be the center. Even if it's going to make financial contribution to your life or some other kind of contribution you're going to exhibit stuff or sell stuff or whatever you're going to do. Enjoyment is very, very important. And if you've gone already far down the line with it, then it's very important to take yourself seriously about it, right? To make sure that you have a slightly, I don't want to say this too rigidly, but a slightly professionalized seriousness about it. Like, I'm sorry, but this week's Sunday morning is going to be all about that craft activity for me. And that's going to be the only thing that I do, the only thing that I think about, right? You've got to give yourself that kind of self-respect for your love for that activity, so that you don't just have it as something you sort of squeeze in between the rest of life. So I think thoughts about defining what the activity is are less important than you figuring out what it is that you enjoy most about it and trying to enjoy it more, and then seeing what place it has in your life. What are your main concerns regarding the rise of AI? M3 is asking. I've got 777. On my mind right now is one of the less important concerns. So it's not a top 2 or 3 concern about AI necessarily, but it's the way it transforms thought. It's that young people are beginning to think like AI writes to them when they ask it questions. That's a worry. I've already answered the kitchen cabinets question. Thank you so much. My beautiful friend Kevin is indulging me by helping. And of course, it's so remarkable, right? I've never had an accident happen while being unable to stand, as I have been for a year and a half. So I'm there, but I can't do anything about it. I can't move these cabinets. Because it's not just that I'm wheelchair bound, I really struggle with verticalization. So I can't really do many activities in the wheelchair either. So, I was very grateful that Kevin has come already twice and been rescuing me from this incidenticus. To yo, Vlad, what made Laura Loomer think that it's now entrepreneurially beneficial? Jake, to side with Ukraine, Jake Broe and I briefly discussed it on a recent conversation. So maybe you can check that on Jake's channel. In a nutshell, Laura is servicing herself, number one, and servicing Trump, number two, and servicing Trumpism, number three. So Ukraine here is a sort of pawn in her entrepreneurial conception of domestic culture war. Use toothpick. What explains the difficulty in creating a vision for the future? Have we simply run out of new ideas? Let me give you a couple of thoughts. Our friend Nietzsche thought that the problem with a lot of the values and institutions that we love is that we need them, but our historical justifications for them no longer persuade us. So, for instance, we might be reliant in part on certain ideas of liberal teleology and progress of a Fukuyamian kind to justify our commitment to liberalism, or our commitment to liberalism as something we support across the globe, or whatever your view is, your commitment to socialism or your commitment to constitutional conservatism, forget it, whatever the ideological position might be. And we just no longer believe in teleology. So that's one example of how some of the things we may need to justify the sorts of the sort of world we want to have, we no longer can take seriously ourselves. So we might be in a set of ways for Nietzsche in this paradoxical situation where we no longer believe in any of the stories that we have told ourselves to prop up the social practices and institutions which we want. Another side of the coin of this is that we are a civilization that believes in progress, that's at the same time lost its belief in progress, and finds it very difficult to talk about a future in which there isn't necessarily progress. There are contingent bits of progress and regress in particular dimensions, but there is no historical progress. There's no Obama type story about how you make, with the zigzag of history, 3 steps forward, 2 steps back. So the kind of stories that we can tell ourselves about the future for now are unbearable to us because they're dependent on admitting truths about the world that we can't at this stage admit. I believe that some of this is constitutive, but some of this is temporary. In other words, a lot of people are in grief and shock about the turbulent historical moment that we're in. And when we pass through that moment and people process their grief a little bit more, they will be able to relate to the idea of a much more contingent future than what would have seemed palatable to us in the 1990s. This is a much richer topic than I've made it out to be, and your question is much better than my answer, and we're going to have to come back to it, and it's probably worth doing that in depth. I think we've got one last question from the ones at the top, and then we'll jump into the live comments probably for another 20 minutes. Nikagam is saying, you seem to be knowledgeable about psychology in the clinical sense, or should I say psychiatry? For example, when talking about various personality disorders, where does this expertise come from? I don't have expertise in psychiatry. And I don't really have expertise in clinical psychology. I'm sick. But apart from being sick and non-functional as a philosopher, I am a philosopher. And my philosophical specialism is political philosophy and moral psychology. When you talk about moral psychology and moral philosophy, you have to understand that throughout the history of the Western world, there have been very many traditions that have all nevertheless fallen into 2 buckets. Either you start to think about morality propositionally, with a set of dictums about what you should or shouldn't do, you know? And the greatest, and I mean the greatest without mockery, example of that in the history of the West might be Kant, right? The only unqualifiedly good thing in the universe is a good will, is the first sentence of Kant's groundwork for the metaphysics of morals. A completely other bucket of doing moral philosophy is not to start with a set of principles about regulating moral life, but to start with psychology, to start with what the hell is in the head of a human being, what is inside the human being's motivational set, as Bernard Williams might say, and go from there. Philosophers in that tradition are very different philosophers, right? Both David Hume and Friedrich Nietzsche, even though they're so many ways polar opposites, are both in that camp. Reason is and always will be a slave of the passions, says Hume, by which he very roughly means something that I'll put caricaturally because I don't want to define it, is that what motivates people is what motivates people. You're not going to be motivated by things that don't motivate you. So as soon as you say that, questions arise about what that shape of the shape of that psychology is, right? And here you're immediately involved in the questions about the depth of that psychology, in questions about the conflictiveness of that psychology. So basically, you are engaged in psychological reflection and reflection on psychological reflection when you do moral philosophy, right? That's a central part of the answer. There is then a couple of other things. I believe it's very important for educated people to understand and have some kind of language about what goes wrong with the human personality. That's all I'll say. And then the third thing is that I think that we are losing rituals in the West. As a hyper-reflective culture, we're losing the capacity to take our own rituals seriously. We no longer believe the rituals we participate in when we go through the motions of these rituals. And that's not some kind of conservative decay. That genuinely is a story of the alienation and disenchantment of modernity that's deeply reflected upon by modern sociology. So we're not doing some kind of conservative siren song about the greatness of the past. But I think that there is at least one ritual in the modern world that is completely immune from reflective disenchantment about it, and that's psychoanalysis. I think that the psychoanalytic situation is arguably the last social ritual where there's no music, there's no dance, ritual where there's just humans interacting with other humans and talking and so on. And I probably wouldn't call musical performance a ritual either, to be honest. But however you cast it, it's this extraordinary ritual that isn't undermined by reflection about it. And I think that an enormous amount can come out of that ritual. But I also think that the picture of the mind that comes out of the history of that ritual, the discourse about that ritual is essential. In other words, whatever it is to explain humans psychologically, the explanation is going to be psychoanalytic. That's compatible with all current psychoanalytic explanations being bullshit. But that means that the container is immovable. It's going to have some such structure, that explanation. Now, of course, even within psychoanalysis, as Adam Phillips wonderfully points out, there's a difference of tradition. There's a tradition that takes the practice very seriously and has a degree of sort of coercive reverence about itself. Then there's a tradition within the discipline that is much more open and much more playful. And you could put maybe Winnicott, maybe Marion Milner in that kind of playful psychoanalytic tradition. So that I take very seriously. And one philosopher who recently died, who I greatly admired, was also a psychoanalyst. That's Jonathan Lear, whose book Radical Hope I recommend to everyone, by the way, because it's not a book for professional philosophers. And then one of my really two philosophical heroes, who are Richard Wollheim and Bernard Williams. Richard Wollheim was essentially a psychoanalytic philosophical writer. And of course, I learned a lot from Richard. Died in 2003, so I learned a lot from him. I learned a lot from his work, and he is one of my avenues into psychoanalytic understanding. But I'm still a novice. I did psychoanalysis or psychoanalytic psychotherapy for about 5 or 6 years in the previous decade, with an extraordinary analyst who not only knew people like Wollheim and Williams, but also had a musical background. So we could talk about specific Mozart and Beethoven scores, but also was connected with all of the sort of wonderful post-Kleinians, knew people like Donald Meltzer and so on. So that was one of the great, great gifts of my life. And that stopped when my therapist died in 2018. And one of the things I most associate with these sessions is a wonderful kind of sociability and laughter. There was so much laughter there. And much more recently, just in the last few months, remotely, I'm doing a little bit of psychoanalytic psychotherapy from bed, which I'm finding a great gift in a very different way. This is somebody of a younger generation, but it's a lot of fun, and I dedicate 50 minutes of it to it a week. Greatly enjoy this ritual. So a little bit about some of my interests there. Okay, Vlad, going on too long. Shut up. Okay, let's see where we are in the questions. The power of ritual is very powerful. Could we get a video on that too? Yeah. You know what is the most powerful ritual I've ever seen in my life in another culture? I'll tell you about it. Some of you who know me well know that an acquaintance of mine, Tessa, was killed by a tiger shark in Tonga in 2006. And Tessa was actually meant to come to my house that night, but she was an American Peace Corps volunteer, and she chose to play with kids and do her activities with the local village children. But she swam out to a boat carrying her friend in a very, very deep channel of water, where fresh water met salt water at dusk following a big boat. And there was a tiger shark cave, which you didn't know about there. And a tiger shark bit off her leg all the way up to her thigh. And I saw Tessa very soon after, maybe 2 hours after, and she still had color in her face. By the time she was brought to the beach, she wasn't alive. And from that makeshift morgue to the airport to fly out the body, much of the island, and this is 2 or 3 kilometer distance, much of the island population, we had a population, Vava'u was the island group, that's probably got a population of 10,000 and the population maybe of 5,000 on the main island of that island group. But many people came out and sat cross-legged, dressed in black, across the road for 2 to 3 kilometers in length. The whole damn island came and just covered the entire stretch of the journey to the airstrip. Extraordinary and something completely inaccessible, unbelievable for us in the West. All right. Let's rock on 10 more minutes. Vernal Equinox. Hi, Vlad. What are your thoughts, again, on the potential existential risks caused by AI? Do you think there are reasons to be worried about that? Yes. What are the chances of humanity going extinct in 100 years? AI is not the number one threat. So people over-catastrophize. People over-catastrophize this. It does pose an existential threat. There's no doubt about it. But nuclear war is the number one existential risk of the 21st century still. It's a pedantic thing to say, but it's there. Climate change is, in a way, the most profound risk, but it's systemic. It's an everything risk. Everything is connected with the climate crisis. The climate crisis could stimulate nuclear war too, or probabilify, as people in the climate movement say. So the climate crisis will probabilify apocalyptic refugee flows, war. It's already doing that, indeed, and could even contribute to nuclear war. So I do think AI is an existential threat. I don't think it is the number one existential threat. And thinking that is the number one and overwhelming existential threat is a bit potty, in my view. I think it's an existential threat, but it's not number one as things stand. Now, what's the risk of us not surviving the century? High. So per century, in my rough estimation, and this is an estimation about psychological disposition, not truth about the world, of course, but in my estimation, it's reasonable in your head. If you want that objective number, you might not want it to just turn me off right now. I mean, just turn me off. But I think that we are in the high-ish single digits for extinction per century, the way we're going. So I think our chances of going extinct, or effectively going extinct as a species by the end of the 21st century, are under 10%, but they're far higher than 1%. Hey, Vlad, how do you protect yourself from addictions in these times, specifically substance addiction? This is a special subject, and I think people have expertise in it that I don't. I don't have any addiction expertise. So I can only answer that question, Parvinu, in a second order way by saying that, we keep on talking here about all the ways we deal with personal hardships, and also how we deal with the senselessness and sort of intimidating precarity of our political and historical environment. So doing better with that is important. I do think that we've got a crisis of men at the moment in our culture, which is certainly not helping with what you talk about. And we have got degradation of public services in the welfare state across much of the West, which means people are not getting the kind of care that they need when things begin to go wrong for them. People are just out on their own far too much. But I'm afraid I'm going to chicken out epistemically and say that I shouldn't talk about addiction directly. Substance addiction. Hi, Vlad, I have to ask you about your view of Tony Robinson. You once said a very surprising thing about him. Is he legit? Well, he is a destructive political actor that we need to deal with in the UK because he has a degree of influence, and he carries an audience with significant and legitimate grievances in some cases not legitimate grievances. But I don't accept the normalization of him by a lot of the sort of ex-intellectual dark web. I'm having a real brain block. Because you mean Tommy Robinson, right? I've got brain inflammation. I'm sure you mean Tommy Robinson, right? So yeah, I don't accept the normalization of him by all of these intellectual dark web people, because there's a lot of destructiveness and unloveliness in his way of engaging with our informational environment. But he's there. We've got to deal with it. El Kudus is saying AI could trigger nuclear war as well. Predabot question about animal sentience. We might do that on the philosophy channel at some point, where I want to talk about animal rights. Tony Robbins, motivational speaker. You mean Tony Robbins? Yeah, man, I've got brain damage since 2003, which has got worse in the last year and a half. You can't give me wrong names because I get names. Yeah, Tony Robinson is Baldrick from Blackadder, Martin is rightly saying. So you mean Tony Robbins? Okay. Right. Well, the first thing Tony would say is, Vlad, your psychoanalysis takes 7 years. I can do this in 2 days. To which my answer is, no, you can't. But Tony would say, yes, he can. That's one thing to say. He'd say, do it the psychoanalytic way if you enjoy, but I can get you the same result. No, it's a result that's going to get somebody more functionality, but it's not a result that's going to get them more emotional maturity and freedom, in my view. Number one. Number two, is Tony naive about politics? Yes. Is Tony naive about aesthetics? Yes. Look at the stuff in his house. Does Tony, in a quite American way that seems very alien to us Europeans, just love money and love having a lot of money, and then the idea of having a lot of money and getting even more? Yes. Is Tony a fraud the way a lot of people think he is? No. Is Tony a narcissist the way a lot of people think he is? No. Has he helped a lot of people genuinely? Yes. Has that help come at a great financial expense to buy his course or buy his seminars, which cost several thousand to attend? Yes. one of the best qualities you can observe from Tony in our culture is that his tears are not about himself. And so here he is a wonderful contrast with Jordan Peterson. When Jordan cries, he cries about himself. They are at least partly self-indulgent tears. Tony's tears are external. He genuinely cries about you. That's very, very beautiful. So in that sense, he's real. He's real. And he has given a lot of people very significant transformation. He's also had a lot of people who haven't benefited from his stuff. So that's how I begin to paint it. But if this has never happened to me, by the way, but if a client in my consulting said to me, Vlad, I'm going to a Tony Robbins course, or I'm buying a Tony Robbins course, would I dissuade them? No, not at all. Not at all. But the problem is that the actual explanation for how the mind works and the actual substance of psychic progress is really something that pairs with psychoanalysis. It does not pair with a 48-hour immersive event transformation. So that's, I think, the beginning of it. But we can say quite a bit. I can say quite a bit more. I could easily do an episode on Tony Robbins. There are some things in the culture that I do follow because I'm interested in them. That includes some pop music. So, I follow certain pop stars like Lady Gaga or Britney Spears. I follow other things in the culture because I'm very interested in them. And Tony Robbins has been one of them. So I've followed everything. He also had a bit of a Me Too moment a few years ago. I followed that too. So I'm quite aware of his history. And if you said to me, Vlad, is it a waste of my time to watch these hour-long videos of his sort of stand-up interventions? I'd say, no, it isn't. It's quite a good thing to watch. What I, in the end, say is that stuff cannot displace the psychic progress you do in, a psychoanalytic space. Tony would say you can. I would say it's completely impossible. I also think that in a certain way, while Tony is incredibly mature and incredibly adept at handling the challenges life throws at him, and he's incredibly emotionally fit. It's a wonderful quality people with illness like me need to have just to survive, because it's so hard being as ill as I am. You have to. There's such a thing as being emotionally well. There's also such a thing as being emotionally fit. And I'm very emotionally fit. Like, you can throw shit at me and I'll keep standing up. Tony is very emotionally fit, but there's also a certain kind of boyish quality to him. So the way he loves his wife, which is very deep, is a bit boyish. So he's got very, very manly qualities, but he's also got some boyish and not fully mature qualities. In some ways, he's incredibly a man. In other ways, he's a boy. So that's it. But I'm not one of those people who think that he's a fraud. He's not a fraud. Right. Let's take a couple of more, and then we're going to be Danzo. Yeah, you absolutely, because I can't. I scrambled my brain. I actually had a moment in the podcast I did with Jake Broe. I'll tell you about this quickly, where I actually almost lied for the first time in the video. So because of my brain inflammation, 90% of the names I know I can't recall within 60 seconds. So you asked me, do you know this person? This kind of politician. Jake asked me about a politician from Nevada. And I didn't know whether I knew them. As a part of my brain, I thought, oh, I think, did they take a lot of APAC money? And maybe I've heard of them, maybe I don't know. Blah, blah, blah. And so, and then I said, yeah, no, yeah. Yeah, but maybe just heard of the name. And so 90% of the time, I can't recall whether I know a name on the spot the way I could effortlessly before I got sick in 2003. So obviously I'm not going to forget who Beethoven is, but I'm completely capable of forgetting who Sam Harris is. So you see what I mean? And it might take me 2 minutes to recall. And the other day I spent half a day trying to remember the name of the author of a book I'd been reading for the last 2 weeks with audiobook. And it's so interesting the way I reacted, like when Jake asked the question, because that was about my health. Because I'm extraordinarily mentally well, but where I can still make progress is in bridging further that space between a catastrophic sense of your present reality with this illness and a slightly idealized sense of an alternate life in which I'm still sick, but a lot less sick. And for me, these two are meeting in the middle, but they can meet more. And so in an alternate life where I'm well or less sick, I'm definitely going to know the name of the politician Jake names. But in this life, I don't. And there was something emotionally painful for me subconsciously there that triggered that kind of glitch. I don't know them, I know them, blah, 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 blah. So that was very, very interesting for me. And the way I'd put this, if you like, a little bit more psychoanalytically, is to say that in that instance, if I'd felt less unwell during that particular interview conversation with Jake, I would have definitely said, oh, Jake, my brain's fried. I don't know anything about names. I'm bad with names, so tell me more. But I wasn't well enough to have that minimal charisma. But what was interesting is that when I was lacking that charisma, I wasn't well enough to have that charisma. A part of me found it a bit unbearable that I was entering that particular moment of the day as unwell as I was at this period in my life. So it's a certain lack of acceptance of my illness that caused me to jitter around about whether I remembered Susie Lee or whatever other politician from Jake's part of the country we're talking about. So I just wanted to share that. All right, one last question before we go. Yo, Pascos. Yo, Vlad, you mentioned the correlation between autism and being trans. Any advice on navigating this neurospace? I know a lot about autism. I'm not an autism coach, right? Nor am I an expert on trans experience. But obviously, if you are trans, you should check if you have autism. That would be my personal tip. And if you're autistic, it's important that you begin to understand being trans in that light. If you might be trans, or if you are not trans, but you're a little bit discombobulated about whether you feel that you're in a masculine or feminine body or any kind of body at all. I won't say more about exactly how I understand that link to work. That's enough for now. Certainly, if you're a consulting client of mine and you tell me that you're trans, I'm obviously going to tell you to seek some expert advice about whether you might or might not be autistic. All right, enough. Lots of love, beautiful community. Thank you for this chatterization with me. I'm going to catch you soon. I'm hoping main channel video on Tuesday, but we're going to see. Thank you so much, everybody. Thanks a lot.